What is the purpose of an agent? Well, the purpose of an agent is to act in the best interest of his client. You want to make sure that your client is in as good of a spot as possible and gets as much money as possible. If your client wants to do something, and this something isn't egregiously stupid and is actually going to benefit him and serve in his best interests, then you let him do it. And this is especially true when it comes to the NFL draft. Your client has worked his absolute butt off to get to this point where he has a chance to play professional football for a living. After years and years of work and blood and sweat and tears, your client has a chance to take the next step, make a living, and provide for not just himself, but for his family and for future generations. As the player's agent, your job is to stay out of the way from making yourself the story and doing something stupid that goes against the wishes of your client. Your job is to get him into the NFL and get him some money. And with that, let me introduce you to the man that you've been watching this entire time. This is Minnesota Vikings defensive tackle, Al Noga. That offensive tackle from Hawaii, known as the Samoan Sack Man, was an absolutely dominant player in college, as he was an All-Western Athletic Conference first-team selection in 1985, 1986, and 1987. Across his 4 years with the Rainbow Warriors, he recorded 33 sacks, which was the most in program history at the time and is number 2 as of today, only behind Mark Odom. And he recorded 70 tackles for a loss, which is still the top total in Hawaii history. In 1986, his 17 sacks set a season record at Hawaii, in a record that still stands to this day, as did his insane 31 tackles for a loss that year. In fact, Noga was so good that he became the first player in Hawaii history at any position to be named to an AP first team, when he was named to that team on the defensive line in 1986. But when draft day rolled around and the 1988 NFL draft happened, there was a ton of controversy surrounding him. Not for anything he did, but rather for the absolute stupidity of his agent. Because if there's an attitude that's going to get you to drop in the draft, it's the attitude that his agent, Douglas Brenner, had. And it deserves a deep dive nearly 40 years later. Because this is the story behind the man who might just be, considering the circumstances, the dumbest agent in NFL history. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, hype up that video, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. Because we post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL with stories like this one that you've never heard of before. So if you like that sort of stuff, then this is definitely the place for you. Thanks in advance for liking and subscribing, and for hyping up the video, and for helping us grow this community. And with that in mind, let's talk about the time that Al Noga's agent made a big no-no. But before I get into what his agent did, we need some context to understand just who Al Noga's agent was in the first place. The man representing Noga at the 1988 NFL Draft was Douglas Brenner. And even though Brenner had some clients, including Kevin Porter, a safety from Auburn who got drafted in the 3rd round that year by the Kansas City Chiefs, it probably should have raised some red flags that Brenner's strategy to get Noga was just to keep at it until Noga said yes to representing him. Wear him down until he agrees. Said Brenner on how he got Noga to be one of his clients? Basically, persistence. I just kept after him. Not exactly sure that should be commended, but whatever the case, Brenner was representing Noga and was trying to not only get the Hawaii man drafted, but was trying to get him to sign for a big payday, which would require knowing what you're doing and would require not doing something stupid. However, I don't think Douglas Brenner got the memo, because he was adamant about one place that he didn't want his client to go to. That place, as you might have been able to guess, that place was Minnesota. As Brenner said on the possibility of his client playing for the Vikings, "I'd hate to see him go to Minnesota. I'd like to see him stay with a West Coast team." Now, there could be some valid reasons why you don't want to see your client go to a certain team. Maybe there's no chance that you get playing time. Maybe they have not developed rookies in the past. Maybe it's just not a good fit and it's too far away from family, and it could be a huge culture change. Maybe there's a coach there that you played for and you don't like. Maybe it's a team that's been incredibly stingy with money and absolutely sucks at negotiating fair contracts. So you're expecting they're going to have to hold out. That's why a lot of people back then, and even today, do not want to get drafted and did not want to get drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals. But in those cases, like John Elway with the Baltimore Colts in 1983, or Bo Jackson with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 1986, aside from the fact that those players had leverage as the first overall pick, and they weren't projected to be round 2 or round 3 picks, the players were driving the conversation. John Elway did not want to go to Baltimore. Bo Jackson, after what happened with the Buccaneers screwing over his college baseball eligibility, did not want to go to Tampa Bay. So if Al Noga did not want to go to Minnesota, and Brenner is just saying stuff because it's what his client wants, that's an entirely different story. Then you get a different situation with the Vikings, like what happened with running back Darren Nelson at the 1982 NFL Draft 6 years prior, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But alas, that was not the case. Here was Brenner making these comments about how he didn't want his client to go to Minnesota and he wanted his client to stay on the West Coast. And yet, Noga was more than fine playing for the Vikings. Eventually, in case you couldn't tell, the Vikings drafted him in the 3rd round with pick number 71, and Noga was thrilled and was over the moon. In fact, Noga was super excited to be going to Minnesota. As he said after he got drafted, "I've never been happier than I am right now. This is definitely the biggest day of my life. All I can think about is that this is the day I dreamed about, and now it's come true." Yep, that definitely sounds like a man who hates the idea of going to Minnesota and playing for the Vikings. That definitely sounds like someone who's furious about having to go from Hawaii to a completely colder climate. So why Brenner said that about his client, and why Brenner was trying his absolute hardest to get the Vikings to not draft him, I have no idea. Because this story gets even weirder with Brenner and his hatred of Minnesota for some reason. Eventually, when round 3 rolled around and we were hours into the draft, with Noga drifting in and out of sleep, waiting for his name to be called, Brenner got the call from Minnesota that the Vikings were going to take him. Brenner woke up Noga, answered the phone, and then whispered into the phone while the Vikings were on the line, "I hate to tell him who the team is." Again, Noga had shown absolutely no animosity toward the Vikings or Minnesota. This was entirely being driven by his agent for some inexplicable reason. Could you imagine if that whisper was just a little bit louder and the Vikings changed their mind and Noga slid a little bit more? He was already upset that he didn't go in the 2nd round, and now here was Noga at pick number 71, and his agent was about to sabotage his chances of going to the Vikings, which is about to make even less sense when you consider 2 other factors. Number 1, Brenner was adamant that his client not go to Minnesota because he wanted his client to stay on the West Coast. However, he didn't say that he didn't want his client to go to an East Coast city or go somewhere far away from Hawaii. He just said that he didn't want his client to go to Minnesota. I guess Buffalo or New England or New York or Philly or somewhere like that would have been fine, even though those teams are further away from Hawaii than Minnesota is. There's no consistency to the logic here. It was just a vendetta against the Vikings and the Vikings only. And number two, even if that was the logic with the West Coast, which doesn't add up because Brenner was representing some clients on the East Coast, including that aforementioned client from Auburn, so it's not like he was geographically restricted, what Brenner said next about why Noga fell in the draft in the first place made even less sense. As Brenner said, making things even more confusing, because Al is from Hawaii, he didn't have the exposure. If Al had gone to one of the big schools like Notre Dame or Nebraska, he'd have been one of the first 10 players picked. So, wait a second, time out. You're telling me that you wish that Noga would have gone to a school like Notre Dame or Nebraska because he would have gotten more exposure and would have been a higher draft pick? Where on the West Coast is Notre Dame located? Where on the West Coast is Nebraska located? The Pacific state of Nebraska, right on the Pacific Ocean. How does any of this make sense? You don't want your client to go to the Vikings because they don't play on the West Coast, but you're fine if they go elsewhere on the East Coast or in the central part of the country? You wish your client was playing in South Bend for the Fighting Irish, a school that is significantly further east than Minneapolis is, yet your only logic giving seemingly for not wanting your client to play for the Vikings was that they're not on the West Coast? That's it? I've got nothing. Genuinely, I've got nothing. Especially considering the fact that, as we already established, Al Noga didn't care where he played and was genuinely happy to play for the Vikings. And it's hindsight, but Noga later played for teams further east than Minnesota, playing for Washington and Indianapolis at points in the 90s, never playing for a single West Coast team. In fact, the Vikings were the furthest west team he ever played for in the NFL. So the West Coast thing doesn't hold any water whatsoever if this was truly something Noga wanted, which again, it wasn't. I think Douglas Brenner just had a vendetta against the Vikings for some reason. Considering the contradictions and how so many parts of his logic are backwards and nothing seems to add up, I think Al Noga just had an agent that despised the Vikings. Maybe the Vikings kicked his puppy. Maybe the Vikings, over 400 years ago, killed his family tree and pillaged his ancestors. Maybe they poisoned his water supply, burned down his crops, as if they were a plague onto his houses. Maybe he bet on the Vikings to win one of their 4 Super Bowls in the Bud Grant years, and he lost all his money. I don't know, who's to say? But whatever the case, against his agent's best wishes, Al Noga was a Minnesota Viking and was awfully happy about it. And I think the Vikings were pretty happy about Noga and how he ended up producing in the NFL. Noga recorded 29.5 sacks in his 5 seasons with the Vikings and was an absolute menace on a stacked defensive line in 1989 that led the league with 71 sacks, which was one of the top totals in NFL history for a team in a single season. Noga played a big part in that with double-digit sacks that year. Of all the defenders taken past the second round of the 1988 NFL Draft, Noga had the second most sacks of them all, only behind Jeff Cross, the 9th round pick of the Miami Dolphins. Noga even ended his career with more sacks than Andre Bruce, the number 1 overall pick in the draft that year by the Atlanta Falcons, although he was a pretty notorious bust. Noga wasn't just one of the top defensive players in the history of Hawaii while he was still in college, but he was also one of their most successful defensive alums as well. And to think, if Noga's own agent had his way, it never would have happened. Again, nothing about this story makes any sense on the part of the agent. If your duty is to act in the best interest of your client, if your client has no preference in location and just wants to play in the NFL, and your client will make more money the sooner he's drafted, then why you'd sabotage that because you hate a certain team for a completely random reason that contradicts things you previously said in the past is beyond me. The job of an agent is to do a lot of different things, a lot of which include talking. But sometimes, the best thing an agent can do for his client is just shut up. Because of the 1988 NFL Draft, the biggest roadblock to Al Noga having a successful career wasn't the fact that he might have been undersized or the fact that he played at a small school, but rather the man that was supposed to put him in the best possible spot to succeed. Congratulations, Doug Brenner. You might truly be the dumbest agent in America. The anti-Jerry Maguire. Show me the money? More like show me no money. Check out our live streaming schedule for the next few days. We're live every single day on this channel, whether we're covering a sporting event or playing GeoGuessr or just taking your requests. So make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live and so that you can join this community. Also, thanks to all our members and our Patreon supporters who get exclusive perks like their name at the end of each video, members-only Q&A streams, and cool emojis to use on videos and during streams. See how you can join this community and become a member or a Patreon member by clicking the link in the description below.